In this video, we're going to examine what occurred when journalists Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham of the Daily Mail interviewed Paul Hughes, who was the lead officer and investigator in the Operation Hummingbird inquiry of Lucy Letby. So the podcast begins with some narration. This was a podcast about one of the most anticipated criminal trials for years. It's now a podcast about one of the worst serial killers in modern times. I'll just make a brief comment about this notion of it being the most anticipated. I mean, I find that a bit distasteful, personally. Later on, Caroline Cheetham makes this comment about drama in court, which I also found distasteful. But I suppose it's true that it was anticipated. At 12:52pm on Friday, August the 18th, 2023, we brought you the news that a neonatal nurse was guilty of killing babies in her care. So what I would firstly note here is that the same thing is done here as was done by Judith Moritz outside the courtroom, where she came running out and said, she's guilty. Not, she was found guilty, which is what they should say. And I think that's very indicative of a kind of institutional bias, inbuilt institutional bias that exists, obviously, both in Hull and Cheetham and Judith Moritz. After a trial lasting for over 10 months and more than 110 hours of painstaking deliberation, the jury decided that Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies at the County Chester Hospital and she tried to kill 6 more. So all I'd simply say about this is that a trial lasting 10 months is not a strength. I have mentioned this previously, but the O.J. Simpson trial only spanned 8 months. It was from the 24th of January to the 3rd of October 1995. Now, I don't often encounter people praising the O.J. Simpson trial. This trial was a good 15 to 20% longer. A strong judicial process, a strong criminal justice process, has a short trial because there's very definitive evidence and there can be no opposition to that evidence. So the fact that it lasted a long time is not a strength of the court case. She was cleared of 2 further charges of attempted murder and the jury could not reach verdicts on 6 further allegations. I'm Liz Hull, Northern correspondent for the Mail. I've been in court throughout. Were you in court, Liz? I didn't realise you were in court. You really should bring that up more often. And have reported on the case as it developed. And I'm Caroline Cheetham, a broadcast journalist. Every week, we've examined what's happened and brought you the details behind the headlines. So Caroline Cheetham begins. So Liz, we've obviously heard all of the drama. So this was the drama reference. I quite object to that term. It's perhaps just an unfortunate choice of phrase, but I do think it reflects their attitude to a certain extent. They consider this to be like a meaty subject that is kind of exciting for them in a way. Anyway, she goes on. And the reaction from court to the verdicts in this case, Lucy Letby is now one of the most prolific child killers in modern British history and she will go to prison for the rest of her life. She will die behind bars. So Liz Hull says, and we know a lot of what Lucy Letby did to these children in the 12-month period between June 2015 and June 2016, but actually what we don't know a lot about is how the police actually caught her and how they brought her to justice. So I love the way all these court reporters think that once something has been decided in court, that has now happened in actual reality. So there's been a court case, we now know what happened. Having observed this case personally, I would have very little faith in any court process. There'd have to be a blindingly obvious verdict, or the defendant has to plead guilty, or both. Even in some cases where the defendant pleads guilty, a false confession has been extracted. But we'll continue. So the narration now says, welcome to episode 54, Catching the Killer, and we hear from Caroline Cheetham again. So Liz, we now know a lot about how Lucy Letby killed and harmed the babies that were in her care over this court case lasting for 10 months. So this jury have been inside this courtroom now for the best part actually of a year. We know that she manipulated everybody around her, that she killed and harmed babies in plain sight. We also know that it was a very long time before police were brought in, and we know that Lucy Letby was able to continue this killing spree, if you like, for a very long time, because nothing was done for whatever reason, which we may learn as time goes on. She was not removed from the ward, and she was allowed to continue on the ward for a long time. And it was, in fact, a year before the police were called in, and we were keen to know more about that process, weren't we, about how and when the police were called in and what happened then. So it's incredible for me, really, that, again, Liz and Caroline place such enormous faith in the court system. You know, they really genuinely believe, or at least they're pretending to believe for the sake of their podcasts, which they hope will be profitable, that Lucy manipulated everyone around her. They don't give any credence to the idea that no one suspected anything because no one saw anything and nothing malicious happened. A barrister stood up in court and said, "We say that this happened," and then the jury convicted, so therefore that is now what actually happened according to these two. So then Liz Hull says, yeah, because obviously that period really wasn't touched on very much in the actual trial. It wasn't relevant for the evidence for the jury. And so we were really, really keen to know exactly why the police became involved and what happened when they were involved. So we sat down with the senior investigating officer in the case, Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes, and he took us back to the beginning when a letter arrived at the headquarters of Cheshire Police from the hospital and the police investigation began. So I just want to mention at this point that this video is painful for me to make, and I hope it's not too painful for you to listen to. We are going to learn some useful things in this video. The part with Mr. Hughes is particularly difficult to get through. Something I'll also say is that this was one of the worst transcriptions ever because he's so inarticulate and incoherent, and he's also got quite a reasonably strong accent. So I think about 20% of his words weren't transcribed correctly. So I'm not correcting all the ums and ahs, repeating words, etc., because it took me long enough just to iron this out. So Caroline Cheetham begins. Thank you for joining us, Paul. Paul Hughes, thank you for having me. Caroline Cheetham, can I ask you about the investigation which you led and just the sort of moment, if you like, that it landed on your desk and how it began, and when you realised, if there was a moment, when you realised what you might be dealing with? Then Paul Hughes says, well, I was running the major investigation team over the Western Syndicate at the time, Western area of Chester, which covers the Countess. So I was asked in May, I think it was 2017, by our then head of crime, to have a look at a series of documents that had been brought into the command team, if you like, via a letter to the Chief Constable from the Council of Chester Trust, asking if we can have a look at their investigation to see if we could, in any way, shape or form, verify or rubber stamp that to put the minds at rest based on a series of unexpected collapses and deaths. So let's just overlook how incoherent that was. Firstly, that's not correct. The hospital wrote to Cheshire Police on the 2nd of May asking them to exclude unnatural causes. The police didn't have any documents at this time. The Council of Chester Hospital and the executives from the hospital never provided the police any documents because they didn't think there was a case to answer. We know that because they held a meeting with the police on the 12th of May, during which both parties agreed this. And I think Paul Hughes is also suggesting here that it was... I think what he's saying here is correct about the letter. Somehow this then gets twisted during the interview, as we'll see. But I think what he says here about the letter is actually correct. What he says about the documents is not correct. The letter had come in, and the doctors, as you know now from the trial, had asked questions, and the trust had, I think, done, in their view, what they could to answer them questions by going to the Royal College or by going to a doctor separately who's highlighted and going to a QC and asking them questions and saying, what do you think? So I was looking to see by QC whether he meant CQC, i.e. the Care Quality Commission, but he did say QC. So as far as I can see, the Council of Chester did not consult a QC. They consulted lawyers, who I don't think were Queen's Counsel. One of those was Corinne Slingo, one was Ian Pace. Both of those lawyers said there's no reason to involve the police. Corinne Slingo very specifically said that, and they were advised about the dangers of Lucy being unfairly or unreasonably identified, considering that the unit had been downgraded. This was particularly cited by Corinne Slingo. So then he says, obviously Lucy Letby had been moved, so the incidents had stopped. As I've just said, this is old rope now. We know very well that the unit had been downgraded, and I also mentioned Corinne Slingo had written this email indicating that she expected and the unit should expect the number of deaths to decline. So this was not unexpected or unanticipated, and yet this is still here being cited by the person who's run the investigation as being significant. Obviously he doesn't understand anything, as we'll see as this video continues. So then Paul Hughes says, and I think what they thought is, have we done enough here to satisfy the minds of the doctors and the nurses who are asking us the questions? So it was for me to look at that. So it's interesting here that he says, and I think What they've generally thought is, have we done enough here to satisfy the minds of the doctors and the nurses who are asking us the questions? I cannot see any conceivable reason why he would take that line of reasoning, considering that that's not what was said in the letter that was written on the 2nd of May. They asked him to exclude unnatural causes. And then when the executives met with Cheshire Police on the 12th of May, as we know, they were critical, essentially, of the consultants, and essentially said that they didn't believe that the consultants were being rational. They believed that the consultants had fixed somewhat irrationally on this, and the executives didn't believe that there was any basis for a police investigation. We don't think there's any evidence of a criminal act. And the police agreed with that because they met with him on the 12th of May, and that was an agreement that came out of the meeting. And the other thing I'll mention at this point is this comment about satisfying the minds of the doctors and nurses. Well, the nurses didn't have any doubts. Even by the time of the Thirlwell inquiry, they still don't have any doubts because we've been through every statement from a nurse in the Thirlwell inquiry, and none of them had any suspicions, none of them had any criticisms of Lucy, and several of them explicitly defended her, and I suspect there are more that would like to do that. So this whole statement is ridiculous, frankly. That's not what the police have been asked to do. The police have been asked to exclude unnatural causes, not get some sort of result for the doctors. Now, I'm perfectly willing to concede that it was a difficult job for Paul Hughes and the Cheshire Constabulary to do. They're not qualified to do it. I don't believe they ever should have been asked to do it. But the mentality of the police throughout is, in my estimation, bizarre. The first thing is that they treat the hospital like a customer. Like, we need to make people who work for the hospital happy. Well, no, you need to dispassionately investigate what occurred, which is what they asked you to do. And then later on, we see them treating the families as another customer. Oh, we need to get a result for the families. That's particularly strongly featured in the Operation Hummingbird promotional film that was made. Well, that's not what you need to do at all. You need to investigate the matter dispassionately and establish what occurred, which is what you were asked to do, and that's what you singularly failed to do. And even now when you're recounting what happened, you're getting all the details wrong. So then he goes on to say, those investigations couldn't come up with a medical cause for what happened, but they hadn't pointed necessarily to anything particularly sinister. So it was just that it was a mystery. So there are numerous problems here. The first problem is that Hughes doesn't seem to understand that many infant deaths, particularly neonatal deaths, can be unexplained. Something being unexplained is not abnormal. It's very common, in fact. It happens all the time. It happens with older infants. It happens not just with babies, not just with neonates, but not just with premature children. Approximately 8% of infant deaths every year unexplained. Many of these are younger children, of course, but not all of them. So that's the first thing. Now, it's unfortunate that Stephanie, as we know, Stephanie Davies has completed her review of the cases on the 8th of May, saying there are missing jigsaw pieces, indicating there was no evidence for malfeasance. Now, unfortunately, Paul Hughes has completely misinterpreted that, I think due to intellectual reasons. Let's just say that. The third thing is that we see Hughes here using this term mystery as if it's some sort of case that needs to be solved by Scooby-Doo. This should be a medical investigation. This is the big problem, in my view, we're referring this to the police, is that they can't run a medical investigation. It's very, and that's not really a criticism, that's just the simple reality. Hughes really hasn't got a clue. It's already clear. We've only just started and it's already clear. It's going to be even more clear by the end of this video, but it's already clear he has not got a clue about medical matters. So how can he possibly run something that is more credible than a neonatologist in the hospital and a pathologist and a coroner coming in, reviewing the cases, examining the infants in many cases, and then of course they had a second pathologist, Joan McPartland, review some extra cases. And yes, I accept they hadn't come up with 100% accepted explanation of death for every infant, but as we know, that's not unusual. If the case notes had been reviewed by the calibre of people that reviewed them since, and they'd had more time, then it would have been completely different. That's what really needed to happen. Now, it would have been very unlikely that the Council of Chester could have assembled a panel of the calibre that's been assembled by Shuley and Mark MacDonald, and basically there was 0% chance of that. But it could have been and should have been referred to healthcare bodies. It could have been referred to the Care Quality Commission. It should have been referred to the Royal College that had done the original investigation. There are various opinions on exactly what should have happened, but I'm certain that it shouldn't have gone to Paul Hughes because he hasn't got a clue. No clue whatsoever. So Paul Hughes continues, yeah, it was a mystery, and I think they did. The only thing they could think of doing is asking the police, do you agree, or do you think there's a case to answer? So I've just mentioned this. There were obviously other things they could have done and other things that I believe they should have done. It should have gone to a healthcare body if anything happened at all. There's obviously a strong argument nothing should have happened at all. But if anything was going to happen, it should have gone to a credentialed healthcare body to examine the cases further. I'm not sure what they could possibly have done, and I'm certain they wouldn't have come up with this explanation of air embolism for everything. With that being said, this account of events provided by Hughes is wrong. It's incorrect. And it's inaccurate because he's saying the only thing the hospital could think of doing is asking the police. Well, that's not a realistic or accurate representation of what occurred. The consultants mounted a 2-year campaign against the hospital and forced them into a corner where they eventually agreed to refer it to the police, and they asked the police to exclude unnatural causes. They did not say to the police, treat this as a mystery and try and piece everything together until you're satisfied. That's not what they were asked to do. They were asked to run a medical investigation. Obviously, that was a calamitous decision for them to write this letter because not only could the police not run a medical investigation, this guy couldn't even really understand what he was asked to do. So what chance have he got on that basis? The other thing that I'd like to mention, which I've mentioned myself, but people have made points about this in the comments that have been very much appreciated, is that the police did zero investigation of the consultants, not just in terms of could they be culpable, could they be suspects, but they also did nothing whatsoever to uncover what happened at the hospital. Nothing at all. They should have been considering the grievance procedure, considering that was upheld, considering that the consultants were forced to apologise. All these are motives, this is all very important context. The police never unturned any of this information. We only know about it because of the Thirlwell inquiry, essentially. And it wasn't really part of the court case. It was vaguely mentioned in court. The grievance procedure wasn't mentioned in court very much, literally a handful of times over the 10-month court case, never expanded on. The jury were never told the grievance procedure was upheld. The whole thing was not discussed in depth, just a few fleeting occasions. And the police never looked into or examined what the motivations could be of the consultants. And now they're just presenting it here. Paul Hughes is saying, if we did what the hospital wanted us to do, which was treat this as if it was a mystery, which is categorically untrue. It's hard to say whether he's deliberately misrepresenting it or if he's just too stupid to understand what he was asked to do. I mean, honestly, in the comments, you can let me know what you think. Do you think he's too stupid or do you think he's deliberately misrepresenting it? I mean, both are equally plausible. So it goes on later in this same passage to say, the viewpoint again was just, it's difficult for anybody to grasp. And really think, did anybody there really think somebody here is trying to kill and killing neonatal babies? And it's really difficult for anybody to come to terms with that. Yeah, it's difficult for people to come to terms with, except we know that Stephen Breary conducted this almost immediately. It's in June 2015. By July 2015, he's absolutely set on the idea. So he almost immediately was suspicious and almost immediately was concluding that someone had killed babies. And he then ran a 2-year campaign against Lucy Letby. So he didn't find it that hard to come to terms with. So then Paul Hughes says, so it came to me and then I met with Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam and asked them to explain to me in a very short timescale we had why I should or should not take this forward to be investigated. And it was then where they explained to me babies in neonatal units, they come in and they grow and they go home. And although they are very, very fragile, very delicate, babies that need care, there's no expectation of death, there's no expectation of collapse. And sometimes, very sadly, a child is born in a condition where they expect maybe the baby will die or they expect the baby will have long-term genetic conditions. But they know that and they tell the parents that. They explain that and they make all the provisions for the parents to be with the child day and night, maybe sometimes, sadly, through its last hours. But what happened with these sequences is the babies were collapsing unexpectedly, so all of a sudden, from a picture of strength, from a picture of health, babies were suddenly collapsing and dropping. So this was really my starting point with the entire case. Before I go any further, he's made this comment about pictures suddenly collapsing and babies suddenly collapsing and dropping, having been in a picture of health. We now know that is utterly ridiculous. I'm not going to address that because we've addressed that so many times. We're bound to address it many times in the future. We just know that that's ridiculous. But I'll talk about my starting point with the entire case. So I can think back to over 2 years ago now when I first began to research this, after I had the initial intuition that this could be a miscarriage of justice. And then I watched the panorama. I remember doing maybe 5 to 6 hours of research on that very first day of the conviction, because I never heard about it previously. I was very busy. I didn't follow the trial. I didn't know anything about it. I was in my own world, writing books, doing my job at the time. That's still kind of my job, but I've not been doing as much ghostwriting recently. So I remember very early on hearing this claim. Definitely in the first week that I was researching, I started to read what medical people were saying about it, and I remember writing something on Reddit that Richard Gill reposted. I don't think he even knows that now, to be honest, but I wrote something about the confession note that he reposted, and I was doing research at that time, and I remember writing about the Operation Hummingbird documentary, and I reread all my comments about that recently, and I know obviously a lot more than I did at that time, but I would stand by almost everything I said, almost in its entirety. I know a bit more detail here and there, and there's a few things that I'd amend slightly, but 95% of it I would stand by from about 5 or 6 days of research. Which does beg the question of what Liz and Caroline were doing over the 10 months that they were in court. I think they were in court. I'm not sure if they brought it up or not. And more possibly why they weren't able to ask basic questions. Again, it really comes down to the fundamental question of, were they biased to such a degree that they're just there to be cheerleaders, and perhaps even the Daily Mail has informed them of what their role is, or are they just stupid? I believe that Liz is chronically biased and just incapable of being objective. I don't think she's as stupid as Paul Hughes. I'm not saying she's a genius. She certainly is not that. She's probably relatively mediocre intellectually, but she's far brighter than Paul Hughes. That's clear. So I don't believe that she believes a word that she's saying at this point, but I do think she was taken in by the prosecution case, absolutely. But anyway, when I first started to research this case, I heard this claim, or when a baby collapses, when a neonate collapses, or however they phrased it, we always know why it happens. It's never unexpected. That just immediately struck me as being unlikely. Obviously, I know a lot more about it now, for several reasons. Firstly, this is a vulnerable infant. Otherwise, it's not in a neonatal unit. That's the first thing. The second thing is the nature of medical matters is that unpredictable things happen. If we could just predict exactly what was going to happen all the time, I mean, that's kind of a preposterous notion, is it not? I've spoken to enough doctors and I've spoken to enough medical professionals now to know strongly that this is a preposterous notion. To say that the collapse of an infant is always predictable, there are always clear signs, you always know, it's never unexpected, that immediately struck me as unlikely. And then just leaving aside the medical aspect of this, of course, I mean, I should say since then I've spoken to so many nurses and so many doctors who said, well, it's just not true. Collapses are usually understood and they're to some extent predictable. But to say that they're always predictable and you can always explain them and you always know they're going to happen, particularly premature babies, vulnerable babies, is just simply not true. And then I suppose the third aspect of this is that the universe is just not predictable. It's chaotic by its very nature. To say that everything that happens in a hospital, a big complex system, is going to be predictable and you're always going to know what's happened and what's going to happen even. I understand perhaps what they're saying to a certain extent. If an infant has a genetic condition, you can inform the parents, etc. But they've lost babies in other years. All hospitals that deal with vulnerable infants will lose some of them. That's a sad reality of what they're doing. And as I've mentioned previously, the progress that's been made with infant mortality is extraordinary. There's been further progress since this court case, and certainly since the 2015 to 2016 period that we're looking at in this case. So I cannot believe for 1 second that they always know when they're going to lose infants, and they always say, oh, by the way, just to let you know, your baby's going to die. Oh, there you go, your baby's dead now. I mean, I'm being facetious, obviously, but that was a claim to me that had no merit whatsoever. And then all the way through this case, we see that apparently the consultants are claiming this. They actually didn't say this too much when they met with Paul Hughes initially. They made numerous statements. I don't think they actually said that too much. They may have mentioned it during the conversation, but they cited other things. This is just Paul Hughes misremembering things because it's mostly Dewi Evans that said this. This is just mainly a misrepresentation of what's been said, but the consultants did make some claims of this nature. So Breary and Jerram as consultants have walked into the police station, and Paul Hughes has swallowed everything that they've said, and basically everything that Dewi Evans has said, hook, line and sinker. And I think there's a very simple reason for this, which I will discuss with you now. So I've asked this question to ChatGPT. Now, obviously, I already knew that the answer was yes. Can you cite a phenomenon whereby people believe and elevate the opinions of intelligent people because they think by doing that, by endorsing them, it somehow makes them intelligent? Yes, several well-studied psychological and social evolutionary phenomena describe exactly that behaviour. Short version, people often defer to or amplify the views of perceived experts, both because they use prestige, authority as a shortcut to true knowledge and to signal status or competence themselves. The key named concepts are below with short definitions and sources you can follow. Prestige bias social learning. People preferentially copper, defer to, or celebrate individuals who are seen as prestigious, skilled, respected, or successful. This is treated in cultural evolution literature as an adaptive shortcut. Copying prestigious models saves the cost of independent evaluation. Authority bias social proof. People give extra weight to claims coming from perceived authorities or from the majority consensus, especially under uncertainty. Robert Cialdini's work on persuasion summarises this tendency. Authority and social proof are two of his principles. Halo effect, a cognitive bias where one positive attribute, e.g. they're very smart or they're famous, causes people to assume other positive traits, e.g. their opinions are correct. That makes endorsements from people perceived as intelligent, especially persuasive. Signalling/status signalling. Endorsing or publicly aligning with smart or prestigious figures can be a form of social signalling. By association, you attempt to signal your own competence, judgment, or status. Economic and sociological signalling framework, Spence's job market signalling, and later work on status signals cover the logic behind this. So I think that's one aspect of the bias of Hughes and the reason that his reasoning has been so poor. And then, as I've mentioned previously, this is a class and status issue. If you had two nurses walk into a police station and make allegations against consultants, in my estimation, it would have gone absolutely nowhere because we live in a very classist society and we probably still live in a somewhat sexist society to a certain extent. I like to think that the gap has been closed on that a little bit, probably more so than in terms of class, but it's still there. I'm sure women will tell you. I mean, as an example, every woman that I've got to know well, which is quite a few, has been, stalked, abused, attacked, beaten. I don't think anyone has been raped, but sexually assaulted and worse. Now, I don't know if everyone would describe that as a manifestation of sexism, but I think some people would, and I think there'd be some justification for that. So I do think there is some definite... There's a lot of classism in this case, and I definitely think there's a bit of misogyny as well. So let's return, with that being said, to the comments of Paul Hughes. And when they reviewed them deaths or collapses, they couldn't explain why to me in making that decision, do you think that question has been answered sufficiently? Putting myself in the shoes of a parent at this point and saying, well, would I accept that as an answer? No, I don't think it has been. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first manifestation of Paul Hughes thinking, I now need to serve the parents like a customer. In fact, his whole reasoning here is very strange. Again, what a hospital does, the whole reasoning we see throughout Operation Hummingbird, and the video that I will analyse at some point soon, we're seeing again here, is also emotive. It's all what would people want emotionally. It doesn't really matter. That's not what a hospital does. A hospital's job, of course, they have to do the best they possibly can for the parents, and they have to handle them the right way. And the nature of being of the field that they're in means there's emotion tied in with that. But their job is not to emotionally satisfy the parents, it's to do the best that they possibly can medically and be as dispassionate as possible about what is the right thing to do. I accept the parents are important and there's an emotional aspect to it. And I'm sure people who work in hospitals will tell you that there are circumstances where you must take emotion into consideration. Of course there are. There will be times where you have to explain, look, we've got your relative on life support, they're not going to get better, as an example. And people that work in hospitals or experience in these fields will be able to give much better examples than me. I accept there's going to be an emotional element, but nevertheless, it's the job of the staff to handle the parents and the patients as delicately and sensitively as possible, but the ultimate aim of a hospital is to get the best medical results possible. If the parents are not satisfied, then that is significant. If there'd been malpractice or negligence or mistakes, if the parents haven't been treated correctly, then or there've been errors that have led to suboptimal outcomes, as we believe there are on this unit, that's significant. But if the patients have been treated correctly and the parents have been treated correctly, but they still feel unhappy, ultimately that doesn't matter because the hospital's done everything correctly. They've done the best that they possibly can. That's it. It's not about getting a result for the parents or getting a result that the parents want. It's about doing the right thing medically. Of course, you do want to get a result for the parents, particularly if they're good people and likeable people. And I know people have, I think Michelle's told me she still knows people from, decades ago who were parents of people that she worked with, that she treated and on the unit. And you do build a relationship, and that's very, very important. And that is part of the job for nurses in particular. But it's not about making the parents happy. It's about doing everything correct medically. And equally, the police's job is not about getting a result for someone. It's about dispassionately investigating what's occurred and finding out what the truth is. Paul Hughes cannot seem to understand this. So he continues. So we declared an investigation at that point, not a criminal investigation, to substantiate whether a crime has been committed, and that's when we sought advice from the National Crime Agency. So he said that without any irony at all. It's not a criminal investigation. Who should we get in touch with first? I know, the National Crime Agency. It's the obvious port of call for us in this medical investigation. So he continues, about how we go ahead and we appoint the relevant expert, the best expert we can have. And that's when I met with parents for the first time and explained to the parents that we were going to investigate the collapses of their children. And at that point, I only made the parents one promise, and the promise was that we would, as a team, collectively find out exactly what went, how, and where happened to their child. So this is being volunteered now. The information is being volunteered by Paul Hughes. He's saying we immediately met with the parents. I won't expand any more on the fact that he's treating them as a customer again. Now, once more, this is something the police may be obliged to do professionally or legally, I don't know. But we know that Dewi met with them for the first time in July. It sounds at this point as if they haven't even met any medical person and they're already telling the parents, the children, they're investigating their deaths. Now, as I say, that may be something that's required legally, I don't know. But it seems to me that this is already very prone to bias. This seems to be almost immediately. He's going to the parents and saying, right, we're investigating to see if there are suspicious circumstances your child may have been murdered. Now, as I say, that may be something that is required legally, but it's going to really upset the parents, and it's further cementing in their mind the idea that something has gone wrong, and then it's cementing in Hughes' mind and maybe the police's mind more broadly that they have to get a result for the parents. And then, of course, later on they go around to interview the parents, having seeded them with this information, having influenced them, and then they start saying, oh yeah, I remember this suspicious thing that happened, which they'd never mentioned previously. But it's not the job of the Cheshire Constabulary to get a result for the parents, as he promised. And this bias that plagued the investigation, that was written all the way through the Operation Hummingbird film, that they released very shortly after I believe it was the sentencing, but it may have been immediately after the conviction. It was obvious from that film that they'd allowed bias to colour the investigation. Now, Hughes is saying here, and I'd always had questions about when they contacted the parents initially, what did they say and when was it? And now, already, before they've received any medical information, they're going to the parents and saying, we've got to investigate the potential murder of your child. So they've upset all the parents immediately. For me, that's inappropriate when they don't even know anything. I mean, to be fair, by the end of the investigation, they still don't really know anything, but I just feel his whole attitude is inappropriate. It's not what it should be. He's not focused on things in the right way. He doesn't really know how to approach this, essentially, and in my view, he's made promises that are wholly inappropriate. So then Caroline Cheetham says, can you walk us through the way you did this? So you walked away from Ravi Jayram and Stephen Brewery and said, we need to go further and look at this, but I'm right in thinking that you didn't look at this as all these babies as one investigation. You did it individually, and I was interested in why and how you did that. Well, we looked at it individually in respect of every case needed to be investigated on its own merits. So there's only one minor problem with this. You allowed one person to assemble all of the medical data for this case and write all of the reports and then hand these reports over to someone, and this person, Sandy Bohin, just rubber stamped them. And you allowed Evans to copy and paste the same explanations throughout the entire case, even in cases where air embolism is utterly ridiculous. At least in some of the cases, Dr. Evans can say there was a rash, so conceivably that might possibly have been correct. As it turns out, it's not. It's completely incorrect because the rash is incorrect. But in some of the cases, Evans just said, oh well, it's probably an air embolism again, or it's probably an injection of air, even in cases where it makes no sense from the clinical picture. I mean, I can't imagine any other neonatologist or paediatrician in the world, particularly a neonatologist, would look at these cases, some of them like child O, for example, and say, oh, it's the injection of air again. It's obviously an air embolism, or that may have been a nasogastric tube one. I can't remember what he made up for that one, but I think it was air embolism. But there's blood, there's the needle insertion, there's subcapsular hematoma, there's blood all over the place, there's a botched procedure, there's ventilation. It's nothing to do with air, nothing. It's entirely untenable to suggest that was to do with air embolism. There's numerous cases where Evans just said, oh, it's another air embolism, and then, he'd throw in a bit of milk occasionally as well. You cannot say that with any confidence. In fact, everything points to the opposite. Any kind of medical professional, and now there's a vascular surgeon involved in the defence. There's neonatologists, obviously. I know for a fact the vascular surgeon is very critical of the notion that there are air embolisms in these cases. And any qualified person will be. It's as simple as that. So Hughes is saying we looked at some of these individual cases, but it doesn't matter because you allowed one person to go away with all the notes and fart ass around with them until he decided air embolism was responsible for everything in the case. And then sometimes he'd say, oh yeah, maybe there's a bit of fluid or milk in there as well. And then, of course, you let him change his opinions countless times after he'd arrested Lucy Letby. Now, I must say at this point that the following passage makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to me. I'd like to go through this whole thing with Stephanie at some point. The next time we're speaking with Stephanie, we already have many things to discuss, so I don't think we'll do it then. But maybe we can do it one day and get her reaction and hear about her comments. And perhaps she'll be able to shed some light on what this actually means, because it doesn't mean very much to me. In any normal murder investigation, we are led by actions, and basically the actions go into the major incident room. They come out and a detective will go off and bring back a piece of the inquiry. I literally have no idea what that means. Perhaps Stephanie can shed a bit of light on that one day. So he continues. In this case, when we started that way of working at the beginning, it was clear that it probably wasn't going to work. And the reason it wasn't going to work is because you'd end up taking statements from a nurse who's been at one event and 2 events and 3 events, and then straight away you're asking a nurse really to recount 1, 2, 3 events maybe at the same time. And then if you've got one case that is explained and then other cases, now how do you separate that evidence? And sort of sitting at Chester, scratching my head, working out how best to do this, I'd imagine that went on for quite a long time, Paul. I decided that we would allocate 1 case per detective. And the reason I decided to do that was for 2 reasons. 1, it gives a unique ownership to a detective that they don't usually get the way we work major crime in this country, but it also separates the potential sharing of the information initially so that the other people's mindset wouldn't be altered by what they've heard in another investigation. So initially, to keep it separate, keep a sterile corridor of evidence. So I think that's largely a reasonable thing to do. There were other problems with the investigation at this point that I'll cover when we look at the Operation Hummingbird video. I think the issue really is that the whole investigation was so plagued with confirmation bias and they just allowed Evans to do whatever he wanted. So Evans ran the whole investigation, essentially. Even Breary and J-Ram specifically mentioned a multidisciplinary review, which was one of the few reasonable things that they said when they met with the police on the 15th of May. Now, this multidisciplinary review never happened. What they actually ultimately did came absolutely nowhere near the standard of what had been done already. So if you're going to overrule pathologists, coroners, neonatologists who would examine the infants, then you need a better process. It needs to be an outstanding process, in fact, because you would usually never do that. So it needs to be a true multidisciplinary review with absolute experts working together in the most appropriate way. or you need an enormous panel of the kind of experts that we've seen assembled by Shuley and Mark MacDonald that frankly has never been done before, certainly not for a legal case anywhere in the world. Dr. Evans coming in saying, I reckon everything's air injection, is not that process. And to overrule pathologists and coroners, and it's notable we only hear one mention, in fact I'm not sure we even do hear any mention of pathology or coronial process in this video. He says that the deaths have been looked at and there was some uncertainty in some cases. He doesn't actually mention the pathologist or coroner. Now, I've seen some evidence that they did look at that at Cheshire Police, but they don't really seem to understand that essentially a pathologist or a coroner looking at something is much stronger evidence than some knackered out old paediatrician who hasn't worked in a hospital for a really long time. No doubt he came in a yellow jumper, coming in and saying, oh yeah, it looks like there's definitely inflicted harm. Why don't you give me the notes and I'll piss around with them for a few years until I've worked it out to my satisfaction, changing the explanations numerous times, even after I know the name of Lucy Letby, and then we'll go to court and I'll change them again in court, and then we'll change them after court as well. Obviously that is not strong evidence compared to a coronial process. So when you take that into consideration and the confirmation bias, and the fact that Hughes doesn't seem able to recount an accurate version of events with regard to what he was actually asked to do, and the fact that they clearly became emotionally involved with the families, which is even more clear in the Operation Hummingbird film, and all of the other points I've mentioned already, plus the mistakes they've made, and we're going to look at further issues with the investigation as this video continues, the fact that you supposedly siloed the investigations, although as we're going to find out in a bit, you brought them all together regularly, is pretty meaningless in my view. I'm also not going to critique the selection of cases. We discussed the selection of cases previously. So then Paul Hughes continues. So allow people to come to a determination of what they were finding on their own, and then at the right time, introducing then weekly team meetings of all the detectives together. Did you hear that? They had weekly team meetings where all the detectives just came together with the analysts and they were sharing information. So we siloed them, then we got them all together every week and they just shared everything. It was chilling really at times to see it drop into effect. So a detective would go on to give the update of their investigation, and the fact that, well, what happened in my case was, according to the medical evidence, the collapse took place at this time. At this time, Lucy Letby, designated nurse, went on a break, handing over care to Lucy Letby. The parents left and the child collapsed. To hear another detective go, oh my God, that's exactly what happened in my case. And then you start building that realism of, my God, somebody independently, this has been investigated in isolation. Now people are saying, my God, that is exactly what I've seen. Now, I'm sure people who are better at statistics than me can point out even more problems with this than I'm going to. And I can't do a thorough job on all this because this video would go on forever. I'm sure if you put the best minds together that have worked on this case from the sceptical perspective, that the number of problems with what is stated here could probably go on forever. But I'll do my best in responding to this comment relatively briefly. So firstly, this can easily be a coincidence. Just simply because someone is there at certain times, you cannot say with any confidence that they definitely carried out crimes, even if you'd established that the crimes occurred, which you never did, as we know. It's ironic that the defence described this as a coincidence theory, because that's what it is. So it's now hardly surprising that it's become a really unsafe conviction and Lucy is very obviously innocent. Secondly, if you wanted to test this theory in a scientific way, you'd actually done the right thing in hiring Professor Hutton. So everyone, or hopefully everyone, if you haven't seen it, check out my interview with Jane on this channel, which is available in my videos section. You will know by now how brilliant Jane is. We knew that already, but I'm quite proud of that interview. I didn't do much except ask a couple of questions, but it was a great interview, and we know damn well if Jane had been involved, she would have brought an enormous amount of expertise and intelligence to the investigation, and I dare say sensitivity as well. And I think it's extremely likely that she would have killed it stone dead. But if you really wanted to do things professionally, you're now citing the fact that we could see there was a correlation because all the investigators separately went away. Yeah, that's great, but none of them know anything. So if you'd got a professional in at a professorial level, they would have just unpicked all of that and they would have trashed it all. But you didn't do that. You decided to cancel your arrangement with Professor Jane Hutton, as we heard in the previous interview with her. So that's where we are today. And then thirdly, the police, or Paul Hughes, is basing these assumptions, even these unfounded or poorly founded assumptions, on the assumption that the data is correct. So we know the data is unreliable because the police are relying on this swipe card system that even if the police hadn't reversed the data for 9 infants, which they did, the data is unreliable because people don't always swipe in and out. There are exits without swipe cards. There's a staircase going out of the nurseries. People can come in and out, as Michelle Warden told me, parents could have been there. We don't even know if parents were present or not. It's impossible to know because they don't have a swipe card and they can be invited into the nurseries, and they are invited into nurseries. We've also seen, in my video giving you a quick tour of the neonatal unit, we've seen how cramped it is, we've seen how little space there is, how little opportunity there would be for anyone to commit this extraordinary string of alleged crimes that has gone completely undetected. We know it's undetected because we've had all the comments from the Thirlwell inquiry, and none of the nurses suspected a single thing. So those are just 3 problems with what is being said here. There are, of course, many more. So then Caroline Cheetham says, because it's quite hierarchical, a murder investigation normally, isn't it? And yet you were given, each detective, this empowerment to say, that's yours, yes. And then all of a sudden, you brought them back without any sharing. Suddenly they were sort of, you called it chilling. These overlaps started to come. Yes, I mean, these are really experienced detectives that work with, a privilege of working with at Chester, and they really know their job. So it was not a problem for me to say, go and do that investigation. They didn't need that direction every day. I was confident that they could go and investigate with an open mindset. So I would question how open-minded they were. For example, we know Stephanie looked at the cases and didn't see any evidence of wrongdoing, but she kept an open mind and said there's things that need to be explained, jigsaw pieces, as she described it. That's what I would call being open-minded, not this horrible confirmation bias-riddled investigation that took place. So Hughes continues, when we did that weekly briefing, put it together, and they were able then to initially get that information from Dr. Evans about the date and time of collapse, they could go against the Countess and start building that and then reconstructing that shift, speaking to everybody who's in and out in that shift. And that's when we got the realisation of, I was on a break and somebody left and somebody saw something, and it started to really build the evidential picture. It hardly seems worthwhile at this point to go over all of the problems and mistakes, so I don't want to do this fully. Obviously, we know Lucy Letby isn't there for numerous collapses. There are also collapses where you can't place her on her own, or you can't place her in a position where she could have reasonably interfered with an infant. There are either other people around, or in certain circumstances it's logistically impossible. That's just a couple of problems immediately, despite your crack team of investigators. So Paul Hughes continues. And then at the same time, our analysts, who you've seen in court, did an incredible job. Minute by minute, they're amazing. They really are something. They were able to pull together the rotors and the swipe data. So I'll just remind you briefly that the swipe data card is extremely limited firstly, and then secondly, it's reversed in many cases. So Paul Hughes continues, but it came to that point where a decision had to be made, so I declared criminality, and therefore the only way to speak to Lucy Letby was under arrest. People say, why do you need to speak to her at that point? Because our evidence suggested she's the one there at all the events, and therefore she's our biggest source of information. She's our biggest source of evidence, whether or not at that point she's a killer, but she's certainly able, on the scheme of it, if you asked anybody to say, well, if you spoke to her because she's been there the most. So the first thing I'll say about this section is that Paul Hughes gives exactly the same explanation for interviewing Lucy in the Operation Hummingbird documentary. He says she's the person who knew the most about this case, so we needed to speak with her, which is rather disingenuous given that you're placing her under arrest. It's not like she's free to leave in the same way that you interviewed other people and they were free to leave. So that was always disingenuous, but he made this claim that they wanted to speak to her because she knew the most about the case. Now, if they were just genuinely interested in speaking to her, they would not have arrested her. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that I've been over these police interviews, or some of these interviews. I'm going to go over all of the police interviews over a period of time, or at least all of those that are available. Of course, literally all of the police interview full stop should be available, but we live in a country where there's no transparency, so it isn't. However, I've been through some of the police interviews, and we know very well that they completely ignored everything that Lucy said. Lucy gave a very cogent, clear interview in which she gave answers to every question, both in terms of her own behaviour, in terms of documents in relation to medical issues, stuff that was happening on the unit. We know for a fact that all of this was excluded because in the prosecution case, the prosecution just repeated the police interview, so they didn't play a blind bit of notice to anything that Lucy said. So there are two possibilities here. Either this is a blatant lie from Paul Hughes and this wasn't the reason that Lucy was arrested at all. It was for the normal reason someone would be arrested, that they thought she was a suspect and they were trying to build a case against her, which I believe is likely. But we're also going to see, and it's already implied here, and I want to be clear that this is something that I stated previously before I saw this interview. I could tell, as it was pretty obvious, that when they were interviewing her, they were looking for Lucy to come forward and give them an explanation for everything that occurred on the unit. And this is so utterly ludicrous, it beggars belief, frankly. They were expecting Lucy to explain away the problems on the unit and give a single explanation, like a silver bullet explanation, for all of this stuff that they spent 5 years investigating, and then it's obviously one of the longest court cases that you're ever likely to encounter, longer than the O.J. Simpson trial. That just shows you the stupidity of the people involved in this investigation, particularly Paul Hughes. I've said previously there's this comment he made in the Operation Hummingbird documentary about it could have been a bug on the unit or it could have been a killer nurse. And as I've pointed out several times, those two things are not mutually exclusive. There can be a bug on the unit and there can also be a killer nurse. Or alternatively, there can be a nuanced and complex clinical picture, which would normally be the case and which is the case here. But he, being an idiot, wants it to be a single silver bullet explanation, or he wants Lucy to come forward and basically say, right, this is exactly what happened. I'm going to put a spanner in the works and give you a bulletproof explanation. It's just not possible. I want to mention as well, both during the interview and when she worked on the unit, because we know this from messages, Lucy did point out things that turned out to be true. They were absolutely correct. But you can't expect her to nail every single problem on the unit and singularly give an explanation for the collapse of infants and the death, like what was an elevated number of deaths. Because we know there were numerous problems, countless medical errors, several conditions that needed to be taken into consideration. Was Lucy really supposed to pinpoint all these errors, that some of which she wasn't even on the unit at the time that they happened? Let alone does she know about them or could know about them? Is she supposed to sit there going as well, this infant is thrombosis, then there was stenotrophomonas multifilia, there were errors with ventilation, this other infant, I felt this, there was sepsis. She did indeed cite a sepsis in her interview. Then there's pseudomonas on the ward, there's issues with intrauterine growth restriction, there's problems with this infant. Then all of the really complex medical information we've seen in these reports that took months to compile, looking at tens of thousands of medical documents, how the hell is she supposed to walk in there and give all of these explanations? And then on top of that, even the world's top neonatologist couldn't do it because she's in prison. She's been incarcerated, basically, locked away in a cell with no access to anything, arrested out of the blue. She hasn't got medical notes. She's never seen medical notes. And all this happened 2 years ago. And they're sitting her down and going, right, okay, Lucy, explain everything that happened over a 15-month period to numerous infants with complex medical conditions. I mean, it's beyond stupid. There isn't a word in the English language to describe this degree of stupidity. Right, so I have to tell you, if the last part was stupid, the next bit is going to be one of the most aggravating and stupid things you'll ever hear in your entire life. But I'm going to start firstly by, he makes this comment, Paul Hughes, we've got to afford the rights of a suspect. There's an interesting interpretation, the rights of a suspect. The only rights that a suspect is really afforded is you say to her or him, do they even say you have the right to remain silent anymore? They say, if you don't say on something that could be relied upon in court, blah, blah, blah. So that, to me, immediately indicates that they were already treating her as someone they were building a case against, regardless of their proclamations to the contrary. So anyway, Paul Hughes says, we've got to afford the rights of a suspect, so she had to come in under arrest. So we arrested her. And Liz Hall says, how was she during that process? Please don't break your computers or your phone or anything that you're holding. Maybe put yourself in a straitjacket or restrain yourself at this point. Paul Hughes, she was emotionless, she cooperated. She answered the question, she was clinical. Yeah, this is somebody that's never been involved with the police before in her life, and she's arrested for murder, and she's, I think at the time, 8 murders, 6 attempted murders. This was her first arrest, and she's brought into custody, and she's subject to warrant to further detention. And at no point did she appear to be struggling with anything. She was quiet, she wasn't obstructive, she answered the questions, she dealt with everything controlled. So you disregarded everything that Lucy said in her defence. We know that for a fact. We know for a fact she gave a very coherent police interview. She was interviewed by the police over the 3 interviews as a whole for over 23 hours. Nearly an entire 24-hour period. I think it was 23 hours and 48 minutes, if I remember rightly. You discarded everything that Lucy said in her defence during that period. You didn't take anything into consideration, but now you're going to start talking about her demeanour. So I don't think Paul Hughes was even in the interview, but you have decided that Lucy's demeanour was wrong and that she should have behaved a different way. That in itself is ridiculous immediately, embarrassing in fact. However, you can't even interpret people's behaviour, even though that's not valid, because she was very obviously subdued and scared. She was not calm or calculated or calculating, as you seem to be implying. She was shit scared. She was trying to comply with the questions because she was trying to demonstrate that she was an innocent person. I mean, we're going to see some extraordinary comments in this section from what is supposed to be a professional investigator and what's supposed to be professional journalist. But the idea that you're just sitting there judging her demeanour and saying she's supposed to behave like this, again, there is no word in the English language to convey that degree of stupidity. And I was thinking when I was reading through this about human history, about all the things that have happened in the world, and then imagine all the problems that have been caused by people with minimal intelligence. I suppose ego problems is another problem as well, being put into positions of influence. So this gentleman here, Mr. Hughes, somehow, I don't know what this says about other people at the police, but this guy has somehow been promoted into a position of prominence at the Cheshire Constabulary. Now, you can tell very clearly just from listening to him, never mind his reasoning. Obviously, if you assess his reasoning, his intellectual level becomes clearer still. But you can tell just from listening to him that he's a person of very modest ability, and yet he's essentially the person that can greenlight this investigation. And there are enormous consequences for Lucy Letby. Enormous consequences for the healthcare system, in fact. And it's all on his say-so. And yet he's sitting there after the conviction saying, oh, well, we expected Lucy to do this. And you're going to see the ridiculous thing that he's about to say. Caroline and Liz as well, the utter idiots. It's so spectacularly inappropriate to have in your mind some sort of model of what you think an innocent person should behave like, and then judge a person based on this spurious view rather than on their words and actions. So you're judging them on their demeanour. You're doing exactly what Judith Moritz did. You're doing exactly what Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham did. You're saying, why is she wearing these clothes? Why is she behaving like this? Why does she present like this? Embarrassing. It's bad enough for Liz, Caroline and Judith. They're all monumentally shit journalists with no integrity. But for a chief investigator for a police department to be apparently influenced by such nonsense is breathtaking. But it's going to get worse. So then Caroline Cheetham says, we had this conversation, didn't we, Liz, about this level of control, composure, calmness. Just as human beings, we're sort of saying, can you imagine, I'd be screaming and shouting and then Paul Hughes says, where's the banging on the table? Saying, well, if you're saying these babies been killed, I've cared for these babies, go and find the killer, yeah, but it's not me. Yeah, there was none of that. It was just, there was very much an acceptance of, you're going to come and knock on my door at some point. Now, I assume you've all smashed your computers at this point, but those of you that are still listening, I'll give my thoughts on that. So, firstly, the comment made by Caroline Cheetham, I'd be doing this or I'd be doing that. I mean, genuinely, I do think in these circumstances, I personally would be saying very clearly that I wasn't guilty and that I would have handled things differently from Lucy in all probability. But I also understand that this is an extremely pressurised and stressful situation with enormous consequences, and she's terrified. Of course she's terrified. However, the comments from Caroline Cheetham here, they're kind of akin to inane people commenting on the internet. The kind of absurd comments you hear from the idiot brigade who essentially have shit for brains. But she's running a podcast for the Daily Mail and describes herself as a broadcast journalist. And yet she's there going, I'd be doing this, I'd be doing that. What a complete and utter moron. Then we have Paul Hughes endorsing this and saying, oh, She could have been banging on the table. It's incredible. It's truly incredible. I can't add anything to what I said already, but I will just say this. Let's say Lucy went, how dare you? How dare you accuse me of murdering these babies? And maybe she threw in a few swear words as well. She's banging on the table going, I'm innocent, you idiots. Would you have reflected favourably on that? No, of course you wouldn't. You would have used that against her instead. That begs the question, because you're implying, if she'd done that, you would have considered her to be more innocent than you do now, or you would have considered her to be more innocent at the time than you do now. So that begs the question on whether you would have treated her as being more innocent, or whether that would have been used against her. And I think I know the answer to that question. So the Liz Hull says, okay, and then do you think you've got the right person? You must think that. So now we've got thicko Liz Hull commenting here again. Did you think you got the right person? Did you think you got the right person? It doesn't have to be a person, idiot. Does it? So then Paul Hughes says, I mean, I was sure at this point, yeah, the analytical, so I was sure that if it was somebody that had done it, she was the only one who could have done it. So this is repeating a phrase that was used in Operation Hummingbird documentary, not by Paul Hughes. So literally this phrase, almost word for word, was uttered by someone else about Lucy Letby, was the obvious person. It had to be Lucy Letby, and I concluded this very early on. So now we're hearing Paul Hughes repeat that. So the idea that they all worked independently and there was no confirmation bias in the investigation, that they didn't all jump to exactly the same conclusion very quickly based on specious and incorrect information, we can put that to bed immediately. But then, incredibly, he claims that he was still open-minded. So we were still open-minded, and that's what we were really interested in, that first arrest and interviews, because she could have told us something that we're going to go, and Caroline Cheetham says, oh right, that makes sense. So as I mentioned earlier, and as I discussed when I first encountered the police interviews, I could tell when they were interviewing her that what they were expecting her to do is exactly what they've just described here. And as I said at the time, they were expecting her to give an explanation. They wanted her to give essentially the equivalent of an alibi. You know, it wasn't me because of this. Like, as if something of this complexity, a nurse who's just been incarcerated, who doesn't have any access to medical notes, so you can just explain the whole thing in a police interview, under massive pressure, with no medical notes. And she's just going to be able to say, oh, look, your whole investigation is wrong because of this. And they're all going to go, oh yeah, thanks Lucy, we'll call the whole thing off. That's how stupid these people are. So then it goes back to Paul Hughes. So we were still open-minded as to whether we would find an explanation because we hadn't yet received evidence from the radiologist, we hadn't yet received information from the pathologist or the endocrinologist or the haematologist. So we had one expert's evidence at that point, so waiting for her to fill in the gaps. So did you hear that, everyone? We had one expert's evidence at this point, so they'd arrested her entirely on the basis of Dr. Evans. We know that for a fact now. So they've allowed Dr. Evans to walk in there and run the entire investigation. This guy, Hughes, can barely string a coherent sentence together, let alone run a medical investigation. So they will have allowed Dr. Evans to do everything. Dr. Evans can then do whatever he wants. So he has essentially reassured them that they're doing a competent medical investigation. Perhaps he's even told them that they're doing a multidisciplinary investigation if Paul Hughes has remembered to tell him that that's what the consultant said needed to be done. And then they supposedly care about this information from the other experts, but it's all incredibly minor points that don't really have any bearing on whether or not the case is going to go to court. In the case of Professor Arthur's, as I've said numerous times, I'll probably say this again numerous times, the evidence that he gave, he made explicitly clear, does not mean that Lucy Letby is guilty. It does not mean that air was introduced deliberately. It just means that there was air present. And he did this study from Great Ormond Street. Again, we've discussed this many times. We'll discuss it many times in the future. In fact, I've done an interview you're going to hear next week in which it's discussed at some length. That study indicates that air can be and is present accidentally. So getting that opinion from the expert means nothing, absolutely nothing. Professor Sally Kinsey gave some incredibly minor details related to blood, nothing to do with the major allegations. In fact, she indicates she doesn't know anything about air embolism. Stavaros and Kenny did nothing at all. Hindmarsh was only involved in 2 cases, and we know that those cases are an absolute pig's ear. Most of these experts do nothing in most of the cases. Again, I'm going to be discussing this in my next interview. We're going to see how little they did. I've discussed this in previous videos. This was all hung on Dewi Evans. We know how unreliable this guy is by now, and they've just admitted it because they investigated her. They arrested her. They'd already decided she was a suspect. They already knew it was going to be her, but they still had an open mind, of course. And this is all on the basis of Dr. Evans, and we know that for a fact now. So Paul Hughes continues, "Go on then, Lucy, you're a good nurse. You tell us what it is, and then we can take that back. So was I satisfied at that point if we confirmed inflicted harm that she was the only person that could have done it? Yes, but was I certain of inflicted harm? 100% I couldn't be because we still had inquiries ongoing. Very confident of inflicted harm based on the evidence we had so far. Yes, I was." Again, he's repeating here, "Come on, Lucy, you're a good nurse. Tell us what happened." It's beyond ridiculous. It's beyond absurd. It really is Kafkaesque. It's very similar to the novel The Trial by Kafka. The overlap is quite incredible. So let's just go over what he actually says here. He's already decided that if there's inflicted harm, it's definitely Lucy Letby. He claims he's open-minded, but he's already decided. He's decided that entirely on the basis of Dr. Evans. We know that for a fact. Was he certain of it that it's inflicted harm? 100% I couldn't be because he still had inquiries ongoing. So he's trying to remain open-minded, but was very confident of inflicted harm based on what Dr. Evans had told him. So the experts that they're now going away to provide their reports, they're not even going to challenge whether or not there's inflicted harm. None of them did. I suppose if you wanted to be extremely generous, you could say that Professor Hindmarsh could have said something. None of the others can in any way challenge the fact that it's inflicted harm based on what they were given and what they put into the court case, and based on what they did, and based on the fact they were given Dr. Evans' reports and largely relied on Dr. Evans' reports. And of course, Lucy's charged on these vast number of infants, with Hindmarsh involved in only 2 of the 17. So Hughes says, I'm open-minded, but actually, he's already decided that it's Lucy Letby. He's basically decided it was inflicted harm, and he's done this all on the basis of Dr. Evans' work. And he doesn't really even understand that the reports that he's supposedly waiting for cannot negate what Dr. Evans has already decided himself. And that, which he told you within a few minutes, it's not even 10 minutes with Dr. Evans now, based on what he said recently in the Panorama. Within 3, 4, 5 minutes, he's walked into the police station and gone, it's definitely inflicted harm. So in this investigation that is riddled with confirmation bias, that's yet another problem. If there was a scale for confirmation bias, this would be off the scale. It's just staggeringly incompetent, inept, stupid, arrogant, all of these things rolled into one. And then, obviously, we uncover a huge amount of exhibits that we didn't expect to find, notes and diaries and phones, and I mean a treasure trove of evidence. That was, you can't have believed your eyes, Caroline Cheetham says. And Paul Hughes continues, no, not at all. And still, when people are following your podcast, for example, they say to me, God, does she have all that? Yes, you know, it's crazy to understand, isn't it? That's what was there waiting for you to find. So I'm not going to comment about this too much because I've dealt with the crappy anecdotal evidence so many times. We know none of this evidence has any merit whatsoever. If you're new to the channel, you haven't seen this before, please go back and look at my video about the diary, the handover sheets, the paper towel, the notes, and various other videos that I've made. It's incumbent upon the investigators and the police to understand this. At their intellectual level, I accept that can be difficult. I really don't want to dwell on this too much because we know all these anecdotal items just have no merit whatsoever. But they're going to discuss the notes, so I guess I'll get into that a bit. I mean, obviously the trial heard, Liz Hull says, that she was obviously enjoying the attention. So there's nothing Liz Hull loves to do more than repeat something that occurred in the trial. She just repeat things that happen in the trial as if that makes them a fact. This was just an accusation that was made by the prosecuting barrister, Nick Johnson. Of course, it's an accusation that is completely without foundation. Essentially, it's utterly ridiculous. If you had any kind of intuition, you'd be able to tell very easily that Lucy Letby was not enjoying the trial and not enjoying the attention. That's very obvious. It should be clear by the fact that, firstly, Lucy Letby had a breakdown before the trial began and the trial had to be postponed. Liz should probably know about that because I don't know if you're aware, but she attended every day of the trial. And also, she should be aware that Lucy had to be escorted into court first and she had to sit there and she was holding a comfort blanket because she just couldn't bear walking into court and having all those eyes on her. Plus, I've spoken to people now that know Lucy personally, that know her quite well, and she's shy, which is normal. And I think we knew that already, but I know this a little bit more background and detail on this now. She's not a person that likes attention. So this is just utterly speculative nonsense, but this section just gets worse and worse. So now Liz Hull says, have you come across anything else in her background that might have driven her to do this? And Paul Hughes says, no, well, she clearly does love the attention. I think she's loved the attention of a trial as well. So first of all, Paul Hughes is asked, have you come into contact with anything else from a background that may have driven her to do this? And she says no. He says no. And then he just immediately, having said no, begins speculating. Because, he's a professional police officer and investigator, obviously. So we hear this claim again that she loved the attention. This is something he said in comments immediately after the trial. He claimed that Lucy enjoyed the whole process, which is so unbelievably unfounded. It's quite incredible that anyone would state that, let alone someone who's in a professional position. He should know that she had a breakdown. For example, how could he make the claim that she enjoyed the attention of the trial? How could anyone possibly enjoy the trial when you're facing multiple life sentences? Even if you're guilty, that's not going to be an enjoyable experience, one would assume. Even if you've actually done the crimes. It's hardly going to be enjoyable, the fact you're going to be locked up for the rest of your life. And there'd have to be some significant indication to support this. If she enjoyed the evidence so much, what he's kind of implying is that she relished doing the murders, that we obviously know didn't happen. So that's not always the case with serial killers. Some serial killers do enjoy killing, some serial killers do not enjoy killing. For example, in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, possibly the most infamous serial killer of all, he actually killed numerous times. And I've heard him state this, that I believe he's telling the truth. He stated that he hated killing people and he didn't enjoy going through the process, and he had to medicate himself with drugs and alcohol to be able to do it. And his reason for killing was not the killing itself. However, in the case of some serial killers, they do enjoy killing. But what we see in Lucy's case, understandably because she's very obviously innocent, is that she never made any reference to any murders anywhere. So I still want to make this video showing you the writings of the serial killers, convicted serial killers, who were actually guilty. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer had a sketch that he'd done, and he explained it after he'd been in prison for a while, that he looks back at it and says, I now realise it was absurd and I was in a state of mental illness, essentially. But he had designed a shrine where he was going to take... I'm sorry if this is disturbing to people, by the way, but he essentially designed a shrine where he was going to put the skulls of his victims in various places and then sit in a kind of throne and gain energy, some sort of ethereal energy from the whole thing. And he sketched this out. There's a drawing of this online. That's the kind of thing you do if you relish the killings. That's not so much relishing the intention, but the implication is you gain something of enormous value from killing people. Not only is there not a single reference to any deaths, let alone any murders, in any of the communications that Lucy Letby has ever made anywhere with anyone, but also there's nothing macabre about her interest. There's nothing macabre about her demeanour. There's no psychological deterioration. There's nothing to indicate that in her home. Her home couldn't be less consistent with a murderer. It's quite girly, certainly feminine. There's nothing about her that would indicate she loved the intention of being in a criminal trial. Everything points to the opposite. There's nothing in the trial. There's nothing before the trial. There's absolutely nothing. Not only is this a speculative statement from Hughes, it's something where all of the evidence points to the complete opposite, but he's just said it anyway. So the next thing Paul Hughes says is, I think we've seen the spurious outbursts of emotion, which shows that she likes the attention. So, firstly, I don't think he knows what the word spurious means, because if Lucy did exhibit emotion at times, and ironically, you criticised her early in this interview for not exhibiting enough emotion, so she's wrong when she does show emotion, and she's wrong when she doesn't show emotion. But on the occasions when she did show emotion, which did happen in court, these displays of emotion were quite obviously genuine. In fact, as I mentioned, you just asked her to show emotion, but when she does show emotion, it's apparently spurious. Additionally, showing emotion does not indicate that she likes attention. I mean, that's just simply utter rubbish. It doesn't even merit any further consideration or comment. It's simply rubbish. So then he goes on to say, but I think overall why she's done it, I think just to reuse her own words, she is evil and she did this without her telling us why. If we're looking for why, then, well, she wrote it down, and in my view, she wrote it down and left it for us to find. She knew the police were investigating Operation Hummingbird, she knew that her colleagues had been spoken to by police, and for me, she knew at some point we were going to be speaking to it, so either recklessly or intentionally, she's wrote it down for it to be found. So this is not the first time that he's made this claim, because when he spoke with the newspapers shortly after Lucy's conviction, he said this as well. An incredible statement. She's written things down on purpose for the police to find so that the police can use it as evidence against her. On what level does that make any sense? And then, having made this initially absurd claim that she's written stuff down for the police to find, she knew the police was investigating, so she's obviously written stuff down for us to find. And then at the end he says, so either recklessly or intentionally, she's written it down for us to be found. So if something is done recklessly, then it's not done intentionally, so therefore she wouldn't have written it down to be found if it was reckless. So that sentence makes absolutely no sense. So your entire assertion here is that Lucy has written things down and left them deliberately for you to find. So it has to be intentional. It can't be reckless, because that would be a mistake. So therefore, if she'd done it recklessly, that would mean she didn't write it down for you to find, and she didn't mean for you to find it. So it can't be reckless or intentional, it has to be one or the other. If it's reckless, she didn't write it down for you to find. If it's intentional, it can't be reckless. So I return to the comments that I made earlier. Think of all the things that have occurred in the world because people of limited intelligence manage to weasel their way into positions of influence where they're able to make decisions. I'm sure every person listening to this has worked with someone in a workplace. There's someone who's in a managerial position. I don't know how much this happens in other countries, but of course in Britain we love to promote people to get them out of the way, and then eventually they end up way out of their depth and they're completely hopeless. I bet every single person listening to this has had someone like that in their workplace. Just think of all the knock-on effect of all the things that happen because someone has ambition above their station, they push themselves forward and they're really not up to the task. This is a prime example of that phenomenon. So Caroline Cheetham says, not a stupid person. I can agree, Caroline, that, and I think I can say quite confidently that if Lucy was to join this discussion, the average IQ level would increase significantly. Then Paul Hughes says, no, she's not. No, she's intelligent, she's articulate, and we've seen that she can do what she can do. She was good at what she did when she wanted to do it correctly, and you could tell that from the way she wrote her hospital records. Furthermore, you could tell the way she intentionally misled doctors on hospital notes, just how smart she was to be able to write things down at the time to mislead doctors into believing that a child was coming towards a collapse, to intentionally mislead clever doctors and colleagues. She's clever. So let's not dwell on the statement about Lucy wanting to do things correctly sometimes and not wanting to do things correctly other times. I just want to discuss the idea that she deliberately misled people briefly. This was all a fabrication of the prosecution. There's absolutely no basis for that whatsoever. It was all just an invention of the prosecution. There's nothing to say that she did that. All of the evidence points to Lucy being the most diligent chronicler of what occurred on the unit. She was the person who was most committed to ensuring that standards improved. She did everything by the book. This is in stated word by Karen Rees. She used the internal information systems with the most professionalism. It's actually a complete inverse of the way that this was presented in court. And every time that they said, Lucy did this, Lucy did that, that's all a complete fabrication. There's literally no evidence for that whatsoever. So Caroline Cheetham continues, but to write that down and to leave it there with the knowledge, as you say, that you're looking at this, she's been moved. It's a small community, people talk. Did she want you to find it? Well, exactly, that's the question we ask ourselves, isn't it? Did she want it found? Did she want the notoriety that she's got? So firstly, that was a crap question from Caroline Cheetham because he's already stated this, so you're just making him go over the same ground again. It's very clear that Lucy did not want notoriety. Anyone that knows her knows this. Why you would want this kind of notoriety anyway, and if you did, you would have referenced the murders in writing and so on. It's just total crap from these three idiots. Liz Hall continues. The prosecution talks about her enjoying playing God, and the prosecution said she got a thrill out of that. In that sense, she fits the mould. In a lot of other ways, she doesn't because she's not an oddball. She's not someone who's at work without any friends. what we've seen is that, she's decided to attack a victim. I'm not saying she picks a victim before, but there's a certain element of once she's picked a victim, however she's done that, whether it's opportunity or however she's decided to do it, but once she's decided to do it, if the outcome hasn't been what she's wanted, she's gone again and again to try and do it, which brings us back to controlling. So I'm not really going to go into this in great depth and pick this to pieces. All I can say is that this is pure speculation that is completely without foundation, is utterly groundless, it is frankly just utter nonsense. I will mention that this guy is supposed to be a prominent person in Cheshire Police. He's being interviewed by national media, which doesn't happen every day. One would think he might enter into the interview with a little bit more professionalism and caution, not just sit there making random statements off the top of his head based on certainly not any education, knowledge, understanding, expertise, credentials, or anything of that nature. So then Liz Hull says, she will have this label as the worst child killer in British history, Paul Hughes. It's often thrown around, it's every parent's worst nightmare, but this is every parent's worst nightmare. Liz Hull, she's a monster, isn't she? You mean, there's no other word really, is there? Paul Hughes, no, I don't think there is. Again, I don't want to go into this too much, but you can see the lack of professionalism using these emotive terms. I could understand these people might feel strongly about this if they did genuinely believe Lucy was guilty, but your job as a journalist is to delineate the facts. It's not to sit there making moral judgments. Caroline Cheetham, I wonder whether you would want to just pay some sort of tribute to your team. Paul Hughes says, it's the first time, I think, from an investigative point of view, we get to stand back and actually realise the gravity of actually what we've done and the gravity of this. It's exceptionally sad and really horrific. I think I already said they're an incredible bunch of people, the way they've supported the families, the way they've continued to build the evidential case, removing their emotion out of it, and that's been really difficult. A case like this, you run the risk of it failing, really, through administrative or clerical reasons, and the jury not getting to a point where they will make a decision on it, and that's what you wait for. But with this team, they've all put their own emotion to one side to stay clinical, so the evidence has been true, and they've not been drawn into speculation or opinion. I don't want to comment on this too much, but I'll just point out that it's ironic that he's praising them for not being drawn into speculation or opinion. Then he goes on to say, but to continue to just follow the evidential chain, which we asked them to do, and to be even at trial now, as we've seen, to be away from their homes, away from families for such a period of time, makes me proud to be a part and just play my part as the wheel went round. Then Caroline Cheetham says, and I was only going to ask finally whether you wanted to say anything about this jury. Paul Hughes says, how do you do that? I don't know. I mean, Liz, you've sat there. Was Liz in court? I didn't realise that. Well, they've given 10 months of their lives pretty much. They've given everything and they've listened to it. And more importantly, they've understood it because they've wanted to and they've just listened attentively. They focused and they stayed with it. And we don't know that. They could have nodded off for all you know. They might not have been paying any attention at all. Just because they gave a verdict that you agreed with doesn't mean anything. And really, I'm proud of them. I'm proud of them, what they've done for the parents. Caroline Cheetham, thank you so much for talking with us. Appreciate your time. Thank you. So I'm not going to comment too much on the remaining section or on that because it doesn't really have any substance. I'll go into the issue a bit more when I analyse the Operation Hummingbird video. It's not particularly interesting. So then Caroline Cheetham says, so Liz, that was Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes. And I think there's loads of things in there that I thought were really interesting just to pick up on. A few of them really, we were really curious in the trial. It never really came out really at the moment that this all unravelled. And it was that letter that arrived on the Chief Constable's desk that was then passed down to Paul Hughes. And suddenly this starts to unravel for Lucy Letby. I'm not really sure what her point is here. I think she's just excited because she thinks she's got an exclusive. Someone wrote a letter, but I would say that's normally what happens in these circumstances. So then Liz Hull says, and the investigation obviously took a really long time, and you heard Paul say that even when she was arrested the first time, he couldn't be 100% sure that there'd been inflicted harm because the process of analysing the medical notes for every baby, pulling together the strands of information. He talks about the police analysts who did the rotas, the swipe data, who was where on what shift, where was Lucy Letby when this baby collapsed, the designated nurse was on a break, so she was covering, everything. That took such a long time to come together. So again, I'm not going to analyse this too much. I just want to mention that one of the reasons this investigation took so long, in fact the primary reason, is that Dr. Evans wrote 25 reports on 9 different infants after Lucy Letby was arrested for the first time and when he definitely knew her name, as we've established. So even a year into their investigation, when they took the decision to make it a criminal investigation and a murder investigation, and they thought, well, we need to speak to Lucy Letby because she's the nurse that's on duty every time. If anyone knows something, she does. I mean, I think probably at the back of the police's minds, we know from talking to them that in a way they hoped there was an alternative explanation. They just assumed there would be, didn't they, for the family's sake, because nobody really wanted to go and tell those parents, we think somebody's murdered or tried to murder your baby. Yeah, good point, except that we know for a fact that they told the parents at the first possible opportunity. And they were hoping that the experts would turn up an alternative explanation. They were hoping Lucy Letby in that first interview might say, oh, have you considered this, or have you considered that? So I think it's utterly incredible that this is being given credence and credibility. It's staggering. Anyone with any critical thinking ability would think, how can she possibly be expected to do that? I mean, it's truly mind-boggling that they're expecting this. So Liz continues. It was only really after those first sets of interviews, after, like Paul said, when they got not only Dewi Evans, his expert analysis, then they got Sandy Bohin in, and then they got Professor Arthurs, the radiologist, and Professor Marnarides, the pathologist. Only when all those reports came in and they were building the case did they realise, oh my God, we've got a serial killer on our hands. Yeah, the problem is, Liz, they'd already decided to arrest Lucy Letby and treat it as a criminal matter and had basically decided that there was inflicted harm completely based on the work of Evans. That's why I've always said Evans is 95% the case, and I always say that's a conservative estimate. So then Caroline Cheetham says, he talked a bit there and it was obvious every day in the trial. Were you at the trial? Was Liz at the trial? Were you at the trial, Caroline? Just the reconstruction of each moment, of each shift that relate to these babies was the most unbelievable, meticulous, painstaking, dogged work. Yes, it's certainly meticulous, dogged work. It's just a shame that they made loads of mistakes that we now know about. So Caroline continues, and in fact, in our podcast episode after the verdict, really, we heard from DCI Nicola Evans, and she said in that episode, Lucy Letby just didn't think of the lengths that they would go to. So I might take a look at that podcast at some point and see what she has to say. Based on this, it sounds like a load of rubbish, but it'll be interesting to see. So then Liz Hull says, yeah, sure. We see from the prosecution case that they believe that she was so manipulative that she altered the notes to make it look like she was doing something else at a different time. As I've said, this is a fabrication. DCI Evans said that she believed that Letby would never ever imagine that they would go and look at the medical notes, the nursing notes, and put everything together how they did in such a forensic, meticulous way to prove that she was the one behind all these deaths and collapses. This sounds like pure speculation. I'll just mention again that all of these accusations were completely fabricated with zero evidence. So then Caroline Cheetham says, the other thing that I think really came to mind when he said it, and you could hear it in his voice really, was just, he talked about scratching his head at Chester not knowing how to do this because it was so enormous. And of course, if they'd done them all as one big investigation, of course the evidence about each baby's collapse or death would have been tainted by another one if they'd worked as one big team. So he talks about this sterile corridor. I think he talks about, and investigating each case in isolation, which was obviously crucial, because otherwise the defence team would have argued, well, this person's evidence is contaminated because they're confusing baby A with baby C. And so it, tribute to Cheshire Police, what they've done really is such a difficult, like you said, massive investigation for them to get this to the right result was a tribute really to their team. So again, I don't want to discuss the detail of that too much because I've discussed them all already and I'll mention them in a summary as well. But I just want to comment on the fact that Liz Hull describes this as the right result. So this level of institutional bias, blind faith in the system, and feeble submission to authority is staggering. It's notable that both Liz Hull and Judith Morris, and basically Caroline Cheetham, did exactly the same thing, as I mentioned earlier. As soon as the verdict was announced, they said, she's guilty. Liz Hull described Lucy Letby as being guilty in this podcast. Judith Morris immediately said Lucy Letby is guilty. Not Lucy Letby has been found guilty, which is what they should say. If you have any kind of analytical ability, the more you look at this process, the more you look at the way the courts operate, it becomes very clear that the potential for miscarriage of justice in this system is enormous. Now, we know that this case is definitely a miscarriage of justice. It's very obvious that Lucy Letby is innocent. It's obvious there haven't been any crimes at this hospital. But I think what I've taken away from it more than anything else is the nature of the system, the way the cases are put together, the way that an adversarial system in practice leads to a very high percentage chance of miscarriage of justice occurring. And I want to be clear that I don't believe the police acted in bad faith. I think they've done things in bad faith since it became obvious that this is a miscarriage of justice and they've done a crap investigation. But I don't think they acted in bad faith initially. I think they did the very best that they could in what were definitely difficult and challenging circumstances. And it should never have been past them in the first place. But you can see from this investigation, from the stuff that we've been over in court, some of the ridiculous things, like the paper towel video is one that people particularly enjoyed, if enjoyed is indeed the right word. You can see how easy it would be for there to be a miscarriage of justice. And of course, it's not as if we don't know about loads of historical miscarriages of justice at this time. This would have been around the time Malkinson was announced that this was recorded. In fact, Malkinson was announced before Lucy Letby's verdict. So Liz Hull is a court reporter. She likes to tell us that. She likes to tell us she's a court reporter. She likes to tell us she's in court. She likes to tell us it's her job to be in court. Hasn't she ever noticed, or didn't she notice around this time, that sometimes courts get things wrong? Hasn't it ever occurred to her that, hold on a second, some of this process might not be perfect? There is a guileless faith in authority that should be considered disturbing for anyone, but I kind of understand it among the general population to some extent. Liz Hull, however, is supposed to be a journalist. She's not just supposed to sit there blowing smoke up the arse of the court and the judge and the jury and the criminal justice system as a whole. That's not what she's supposed to do. When she's reporting on it, she reports what happens in court, but she's supposed to go away and reflect on that objectively, dispassionately, using critical thinking and intelligence, which she seems to be singularly incapable of doing. There's always this conflict in my mind between whether or not she's just plain stupid or is she completely biased. Is she systematically biased? Partly because of a podcast, partly because she might have been asked to give a guilty perspective for the Daily Mail, partly because it's her bread and butter and she doesn't want to bite the hand that feeds her, and possibly other factors as well. And I don't want to list all of them at this point. I think the answer is that, personally for me, that she is biased and she's determined to continue this guilty narrative. She must objectively have doubts, in my opinion, but I also do think she's genuinely stupid and naive. There can be an element of her doing the job that she's required to do or being asked to do or feels that she should do, and there can be an element of her thinking that she doesn't want to go against the system, that her bread and butter is going with the system, and I can understand that. However, I do think she genuinely has an institutional bias. Now, I talked about this in a previous video. It's called Reflections on Society. I forget the entire title. And I was talking about why people have an inbuilt need, an ingrained, socially conditioned need to believe in the system, to believe in authority, to believe in these social systems and infrastructure that are supposed to ensure that society runs somewhat adequately. However, I don't think, as a journalist, that she qualifies for that term. As a journalist, you should be wise to that, and you should balance that against what should be natural scepticism and a natural questioning of things. So one of the reasons this has become prominent is because Claire C. D'Oliveira picked up on some of the problems with this case and had questions about it. And she didn't just think, oh, well, it's the system will be correct, I'll just turn my brain off. She followed up on those questions, she became curious about it, she learnt about it, then she referred to Rachel Aviv, and you've now read the infamous New Yorker article that was written by Rachel. That's what a journalist should do, that's what an actual journalist does, and Liz just does not do that. She simply doesn't do it. So I wouldn't describe her as a journalist, I'd describe her as a repeater. She just sits in court, writes things down and then repeats them. She's not really a journalist because journalists ask questions. One of the defining qualities of any competent journalist is that you ask questions. She doesn't ask any questions, she just tells you what's happened. So we're in the final furlongs of this now. Caroline Cheetham. Those chilling moments when they had a team briefing, they all came to those briefings, and that was the moment where they were saying, well, that was my case. Then Liz Hull says, yeah, you can imagine sitting in them, imagine saying, oh, well, my nurse was on a break when the baby collapsed, or my parents had gone to get some food, or my parents had gone to pick their kids up from school. And the realisation that, the people that were in the room with the baby most of the time had left and Lucy was on her own with that child. You can imagine kind of like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you were in that room full of detectives. So I don't want to really comment on that too much, except to say that this is emotive, not analytical. I always lean into things being analytical, fact-based, evidence-based, not emotive. As soon as you start getting emotive about things, you're less likely to draw sensible conclusions. So then Caroline Cheetham says, and then sort of looking at each other as these overlaps emerge and it becomes really clear what they might be dealing with. And again, to go back to that letter, obviously sparked by the consultants, who we've heard so much about, the gang of four, they didn't give up trying to get to the truth. No, and we don't really know the exact timeline of what happened in between Lucy Letby being taken off the ward and the consultants going to management saying, you must call in the police. We suspect that they essentially forced the hand of management. Now, obviously, I've covered the full timeline of this. It's correct of Liz Hall to say they forced the hand of management. Obviously, she sees this as a noble act, whereas based on the actual picture of what occurred, it's not a noble act. Then Caroline Cheetham continues. I think we did hear in court, Liz, what we did hear in court, Liz, was that the consultants were asked to apologise to Lucy Letby. I didn't realise you were in court, Caroline. You really should bring that up more often. So then Liz Hall says, what the trust was saying was, well, we've done an investigation, HR investigation, and we found no evidence, so we think she can resume working. They were planning to put her back on the neonatal unit, and then Caroline Cheetham says, you should apologise to her for the way you've treated her, and in fact we have sat down and done a really in-depth interview with Dr. John Gibbs, which we're going to be bringing you in another episode in the next couple of days. But he does make the point to us in that interview that they did write that letter. They had no choice but to write that letter. So it seems to me, based on this discussion, that Paul Hughes has come onto this podcast to explain the police investigation. He's been interviewed by two so-called journalists, and at the end of it, they have the wrong impression on what actually occurred on the unit, because they seem to believe that the consultants have written the letter to trigger the investigation, which of course is not what happened. So I don't really blame Liz and Caroline for that. That's really the fault of Paul Hughes, who has completely failed to convey what actually occurred in the investigation. So then Liz Hall says, they've been vindicated, those consultants, by these verdicts, They obviously realised that something terrible was happening on that neonatal unit. Caroline Cheetham. We've talked before about the whistleblowing policy in this case has failed. They tried to blow the whistle on numerous occasions, and we will hear in episodes to come, and we have heard in previous episodes that there are calls for that to be looked at, why that whistleblowing policy didn't not work, why she was allowed to be on the ward for so long after babies were collapsing and dying, and consultants were saying, hang on a minute, we're really worried. So I'll just mention that in an interview next week we're going to hear someone who's very qualified to speak on this say that Lucy was the whistleblower, not the consultants. So then Liz Hall says, the sad truth about this case is after those doctors went to management and said that this nurse is the common factor, and she was the only one on duty when these babies collapsed or died, that other babies were harmed and other babies died. And Dr. Gibbs actually said in his evidence, that the triplet shouldn't have died, and that was the tipping point. So there will be consequences, you would imagine, for the Countess and those managers. Caroline Cheetham says, we should add here that we have tried to speak to every single manager, Liz, that was named in court, and so far none of them have wanted to speak to us. And Liz says, no, that's correct, Caroline. We have tried to approach Tony Chambers, Alison Kelly, Karen Rees and Ian Harvey, and none of them have been prepared to talk to us. In fact, Cheetham says, they've been vehemently opposed to talking to us. Now, I can't imagine why they felt that way. Can anyone who's listening to this or watching this, can you work out why they were vehemently opposed to speaking to Liz and Caroline? Because I've got no idea. So the final comment made is correct. There will be an inquiry, a non-statutory inquiry, and we do know that the four consultants named in court, who we have tried to speak to, they have said they will cooperate with any kind of inquiry. So hopefully the questions that we and all of our listeners and everyone following this story are asking will be asked during an inquiry, and maybe we'll start to get some answers to some of those questions. So I'm now going to summarise 12 important things that we have learnt from this admittedly long video. I'm not going to say that we learned that Liz and Caroline are poor journalists or that Paul Hughes is stupid, because we already knew that. So in summary, point 1 is the criminality of Lucy Letby was decided entirely based on the evidence of Dr. Evans. 2, my impression that they were expecting Lucy Letby to give some sort of silver bullet explanation effectively an alibi in the police interviews, was absolutely correct, and Paul Hughes has confirmed that. 3. There is an unbelievably strange emphasis on Lucy's demeanour, which seems not only specious but completely unprofessional. 4. We've witnessed numerous embarrassing comments on how Lucy apparently should have behaved, and that seems to have had some impact on how certainly Paul Hughes viewed her, even with regard to her innocence or guilt. 5. The police are completely convinced that the anecdotal evidence that was used in court has validity, even though that has been torn to shreds now. 6. Paul Hughes was unable or unwilling to communicate the events that led to the investigation with any degree of accuracy. 7. There is a staggering lack of objectivity coupled with poor reasoning from Hughes throughout this interview. 8. There is what I would deem to be a complete lack of professionalism from Hughes as he engages in continuous and idle speculation. 9. There is a circumstantial case that was used in court that is advanced as being extremely important by Hughes, despite the many known problems with it. 10. We know for a fact, and it's made clear once again here, there was no effort to investigate the grievance procedure at the hospital or the background to this or any of the backgrounds of the consultants. There was enormous bias with regard to the way people were viewed, treated and investigated. I should add that I believe that this is rooted in classism and to some degree misogyny. 11. There was a strong tendency from Hughes to make emotive arguments, which again underlines the impression that we get from the Operation Hummingbird promotional film that they became emotionally involved. And 12. Caroline and Liz once again indicate their guileless yet unshakable faith in the court system. So, I apologise that was a long video, it took a while to get through, but I wanted to make sure I responded to all the points. One of the things that's worrying for me, or kind of scary in a way for me, is that if you don't know a lot about the case, that podcast could have seemed superficially convincing. If you know the details, obviously, I think even people that are intelligent, thoughtful, they will see some of the problems, but that could actually have been quite convincing to someone who doesn't actually understand the case. When you do understand the case, you see the egregious problems with it. I just wrote on one of Mark May's videos that something that has to come out of this is that the police almost need to be re-educated in how to investigate a case, because the thinking of Hughes is so awry from where it should be, it's unbelievable. In a way, it would be reassuring if the police were corrupt, because then you could just say, oh, well, it's a few bad eggs. That's unfortunate. It's a great shame. Obviously, the heads need to roll. Hopefully, it won't happen again. But I think the worst thing about this investigation, the worst thing about this whole situation, is that I think Cheshire Police tried their best. With that being said, if you can leave any comments, if you can like the video, I've just put my subscribers up. I haven't asked for subscribers for a while. I'm very appreciative of having got to 3,500, but if you're not subscribed to the channel, if you've enjoyed this video, then it's always appreciated if you can subscribe. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of comments for this video. I'll be really interested to hear your views on the podcast and in my interpretation of it and anything you have to add. So I look forward to receiving those, and I'll speak to you all again soon.